I talked about the DC Court of Appeals ruling saying that Trump was not immune tonight on my podcast, or last night on my podcast. And one of the things that I talked about was the fact that conservatives clearly either haven't read the ruling or are failing to understand the ruling because they're whining and complaining that, oh, they're saying the presidents don't have any immunity. No, that's not what it said. If you want to go understand what it said, go watch the replay of my podcast and you'll see exactly what it said. And I go over it with a in detail analysis of much of what it says and explain why y'all are wrong about it saying that presidents have no immunity. Clearly, they discuss some examples where presidents do have immunity. They just say that in this specific case, Trump doesn't have immunity. And they also say that the idea that presidents have blanket immunity is also absurd. So there's no blanket immunity to do anything you want. And there's also, in this case, there's no immunity. But that doesn't mean that there's no immunity at all. Logic is not something that conservatives seem to get, though. But the other thing that I found really interesting about the ruling that I haven't really seen many people talking about is that in the ruling itself, that they cite at least 2 times Clarence Thomas's dissent in another ruling, which is genius. It is absolutely genius that they did this. Why? Because if the Supreme Court decides to take this up, in order for the conservative activists on the Supreme Court to overturn this ruling, it would have to involve Clarence Thomas having to disagree with his own logic. He would have to disagree with his own arguments that he made in previous dissents. Now, normally I have a problem when courts use dissents for their arguments, but in this case, it's pure genius. Because again, in order for them to get all the conservatives to say that the DC Court of Appeals ruling is incorrect, they would have to get Clarence Thomas to explain why his argument was wrong in a previous dissent. Twice. Pure genius. And then the other part is that there's a good chunk of the argument that was made that basically says that the reason why they have the authority to make this ruling stems in Marbury versus Madison and explains why Trump's arguments about Marbury versus Madison are wrong. But if they're going to overturn the arguments made in Marbury versus Madison, if they're overturning the judicial review of Marbury versus Madison, they would then create a paradox, because how could they then do judicial review by overturning their power to do judicial review? So the ruling is just sheer genius. It's probably one of the best rulings I've ever reviewed on my podcast. But I'm still just enamored with the fact that they used Justice Thomas's dissents to preemptively stop him from being able to overturn this ruling. Just genius.